Hello, you're watching the Great Canadian Bagel here, and today I have my New Brunswick 2024 post-mortem. Now, before I begin, I'd like to once again shout out all my channel members. I really appreciate the support you guys give the channel, and if you want to support me, just go in the link in the description below and press that join button. Every little bit helps. Otherwise, do your regular YouTube things like share, subscribe, and comment below. And one final addendum, I am still running my Nova Scotia poll. I will be finishing that relatively soon, in the next week or so. I will have it in the pinned comment here, so if you are a Nova Scotian and you want to participate in my poll, by all means, go and fill that out. Well, that, let us begin. So, let's start with the elephant in the room here. My last published video was not my final forecast. On my final forecast, I posted in the community tab, and I did technically post it after the election had occurred, whatever you want to call it. Now, the result is from my model. I did not change anything, but I can understand why you might not trust that result. The reason I did not publish before the election is twofold. One, I actually just didn't have the time to do that. I will bring it up here. We look at these opinion polls. The 2 of 3 polls we had in the entire election occurred the 2 days before, and I was busy that weekend, so I did not really have time to do it. But the second part is, now, I am not immune to errors. Sometimes I make some slight mistakes. I didn't actually fully trust these polls. Egg on my face there, I should have. Because they were forecasting that, I think it'll be easiest to see here. I can open up this forum poll. These polls were forecasting that St. John area is going to swing significantly to the Liberals. Now, for those not familiar with New Brunswick, in previous cycles, St. John's area, especially when you include the rural parts of the Bay of Fundy coast, is like traditionally the most conservative part of New Brunswick. So this swinging dramatically towards the New Brunswick Liberals seemed implausible. Well, it did. Now, when I put that into my model, I ended up getting this. So my model does mostly correctly forecast this. That swing. Some of these rural counties or ridings slipping, like this guy and this guy here, I can't even name the top of my head. That's pretty much impossible. No one was going to get those. Those swings are entirely unpredictable. The cities are a little easier. My model underestimated the greens. That's just a quirk of how my model doesn't like small parties. It's not much it can do. And also the redrawing of the districts made it very difficult because a lot of the green voters were in a different district. But because the leader was there, anyways, I'll get into that. The leader was changed districts because the boundaries were redrawn, so it made things very complicated for that particular one, which is one of the reasons why I will say, and anyone else who does this forecasting, you're never going to get 100% on average. I aim to be in the 90s. I like to be around 95 on hit rate. Sometimes I don't get there. Sometimes I get 100%, like in the last US election. But it is what it is. When you're modeling, what I'm doing here, is it fundamentally probabilistic in a sense, because I'm putting probabilities. My model is actually deterministic, but the polls are probabilistic, so when I have probabilistic data going into a deterministic model, it is going to have probability to it, if that makes sense. So things like that, like David Kuhn winning, makes perfect sense if you're on the ground, if you know New Brunswick, if you know the regions. The math has a really hard time getting that. And also, my model doesn't really handle candidate quality very well, because in most cases, candidate quality doesn't matter. Sometimes it does, but it doesn't handle it very well. So if we go... Oh, I don't need this open anymore. So we go here. I don't have any comparisons by regions. I could, because there's only 2 polls, so the raw polling is just the average of 2 polls. So that's like irrelevant, like for the regions, that is. But I did have it here for the national numbers. So even the raw polling isn't very good here. And it's not because the pollsters are bad. It's really just because Holt has a bunch of momentum at the end of the game. And she wins because of that, which I'll touch into a bit. But if you compare myself to like 338 or any other of the big pollster names or forecasting names in Canada, we did roughly the same. I don't know what his seat hit rate is, because I didn't take a screen capture of his map before he updated it. But I can look back into it, because he does publish this, the popular vote before the election, and we're roughly the same in mean squared error. Regionality, I do perfectly fine in the north and rural southwest, and Fredericton, actually. Fredericton I do really well. Regionality, the mean squared error typically is higher than national or province-wide numbers, if that makes sense. But I do terrible in Moncton, rural southwest, and a little bad in St. John. Particularly hit rate in St. John. I get a lot of seats wrong in St. John. So, what happened here? Like, why is my forecast a little mediocre when I factor in once you factor in that I published technically after the election date, but I did not use any new data. I had a hit rate of about 84%, which is not terrible, but it's much lower than I would have expected or hoped for. But why did this happen? Well, as I've touched on in other videos, polling error happens really in a predictable fashion, but it's hard to capture. In this particular case, I will actually go to this map because it's easier to see. What's worth noting is looking at what regions swung. The city of Moncton, parts of Fredericton. And this big old rural riding here has a lot of suburban/exurban parts of Fredericton in it. The center of St. John, Rothsay, Kippamassis, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. These are areas, and actually this part of St. John too, which is kind of suburby-ish. It's technically in the city proper, but it's like suburby-y. It's also very, very close. The PC's only barely won it. What's remarkable across all these is they're all cities. All the cities of New Brunswick swung massively. Yes, you can look at some rural areas like this guy here, which is in some sense somewhat suburby. Over here. And over here. A little bit. I'm overselling it. There's some... I think Sussex is in here too. But anyways, this guy over here, a little bit. But then the other interesting thing is you look at places like the north. Some of these ridings, not this one, like this one, you guys here, they swung pretty heavily against the Liberals. Not enough to matter, but remarkably so. So we're seeing, in a sense, a little tiny bit of language polarization. I don't think it's safe to say the language polarization in New Brunswick is gone. I still think that is a major issue. Now, will the next PC leader be able to fix that? Because part of the reason in this particular election that you did not see language depolarization really change that much is of the things Higgs did that actually hurt him politically and actually caused people to be genuinely angry at him. Because I caveat with those things because people think the policy 713 made people mad at him, which is not true. It was a broadly popular policy in New Brunswick. It's so popular, in fact, that Holt had to water down her opposition to it from repealing it to what age is appropriate. And as soon as you're talking about numbers, like age, as opposed to should we have this or not, you are conceding a lot on that ground, which tells you it has to be a popular issue, or else why would you concede that ground? Well, one of the reasons Higgs is still... even if language depolarization is occurring in New Brunswick, one of the reasons why you still see a lot of it in this particular election is Higgs actively annoyed Francophones in his last term. I don't recall all the precise details here off the top of my head, but suffice it to say, I believe he was fighting them on French immersion. I think that's what it was. Something about French immersion classes. I don't recall the details off the top of my head, but that's the gist of it. And most of these videos are not scripted, by the way. Or at least heavily scripted. Okay, so that explains why the North swung a little bit, but didn't swing a lot. Because they kind of liked Policy 713. They did not like the French immersion stuff. So it kind of washed. And you're seeing a little bit of rural-urban depolarization, perhaps. Or polarization, perhaps, in New Brunswick. But I think really the big thing here, and one of the reasons the polls missed, is to do with... So, as I've touched on before, there's two main demographics pollsters have trouble with. Renters and rural people, particularly farmers. Farmers just don't answer polls. That's why Trump overperformed polls the other day. The rural vote did way better than anyone would have thought it was going to do, both in turnout and in partisanship. But the other group that is hard to capture is renters. Renters are hard because they move a lot. They also don't answer polls a lot, because usually renters are the most busy of the working class people, because they're usually people who have to work the most of the working class. Because they're usually in that really unenviable category of enough money that they get very minimal social assistance, i.e. they're not subsisting on welfare anymore, but they're also not having enough money to be comfortable. So they're in a very tricky bracket for most renters, especially in places like Atlantic Canada, because home ownership rates are so high in Atlantic Canada that pretty much anyone who's like middle class or higher owns a house. So it's really just the lower middle class who rent, or students, or people who just moved here who are transitioning. But anyways, I digress. So this group doesn't answer polls a lot. And one of the big issues in this particular election, which I think was underreported in the media and undercaptured by myself, was what some people have dubbed inflationitis. But not just broad level inflation, which technically is not really Higgs's fault, but it doesn't matter, he's the government. It does not matter who actually did a thing, it matters who's in charge when thing happens. That is what it is. But particularly rent. Rent was the big issue. Rent in a lot of the New Brunswick cities has been going up really fast. Now that's true across Canada, but when you have, say, St. John, and you're seeing double-digit rent growth, and it's primarily demographic, the demographic who is experiencing double-digit rent growth is usually low-propensity voters who don't answer polls. If they actually turn out and vote, suddenly a massive thing can happen. You can have an unexpected swing. In this particular case, I keep saying that they don't usually answer polls because, again, actually, technically speaking, Main Street almost banged on the Liberals, so right on Main Street. But the PCs were overestimated in these polls, which is kind of how this works. Form underestimated the Liberals a little bit. So, this is all to say, Higgs's mistake really beyond just being completely delusional and not seeing that St. John was moving, which I'll get into in a moment. But his main mistake is essentially the thing he was triumphing really, or like touting really hard in the campaign, which is the New Brunswick population is growing for the first time in whatever number of years. But that's precisely why rents are going up so high, particularly in the cities. And since he hadn't really done sufficient work on housing, sufficient work on trying to reduce population growth, he had no credibility on this ground, so people rallied around Holt to oppose him, to replace Holt or Siggs. The tricky thing here, though, for Holt going into the next term, beyond the fact that New Brunswick does have a curse where most premiers rarely last a term, let alone two. I think most have been. I think that Higgs is the first two-term premier for like 30 years in New Brunswick. But anyways, is she has a pretty big headwind on her. She has to try to fix a lot of these economic issues that really New Brunswick has no control over. New Brunswick really has no impact on inflation in Canada. Has very little impact on rent prices in itself. Yeah, maybe Holt could do some reforms on housing and get housing built. And you can do that, great for Holt. But that's a very tricky thing to do. It's certainly a possible thing to do. But it's not as simple as saying just build more housing, because housing is not just a thing you can build. It requires goods, it requires labor, it requires capital. And you have to increase all three. You can't just spend more money on housing. Like, the government can't just spend $1 billion building houses because there's not enough materials and there's not enough labor. No new houses will be built. You'll just make tradesmen really rich. Or there's not enough goods, but you have plenty of labor, then the tradesmen are going to be laid off and sitting idle. So it's not a trivial thing to fix, which is why both federally or in any part of the country, anyone who saying that we should just build more housing is wildly overselling their solution. The solution to the housing crisis cannot just be a supply side issue. It's just not a practicable solution. Now, Holt could take a page from like Quebec and try to reduce population growth by opposing immigration, by fighting with the feds for it. It's very unlikely that she will do that. Maybe she'll benefit because maybe Trudeau's reforms federally about temporary workers and reducing the permanent quota by 100,000 and stuff like that. Maybe that will be enough that it will depressure this. So rent will probably still be going up faster than inflation, but if it's going up from 10% a year to 5% a year, maybe that will give her some breathing room on the issue. It remains to be seen. But these are issues that Holt has to be paying attention to in this term of hers, her first term here. If she doesn't address this, she's probably going to get skunked out as well when the New Brunswick PCs no longer have a leader who is actively reviled by about 40% of the population. That being the Francophones, because again, Higgs kept picking fights with the Francophones, and his past was with the Confederation of Region parties usually not looked upon fondly from Francophones. So that's an interesting thing here, in that this might be one of the only times in Canada, not the only time, sorry. This is one of the first time in a long time in Canada that polls actually missed the Liberal margin. Main Street got close. Kudos to Main Street, but actually they were within margin of error. But they still underestimated it because they overestimated the PCs. My model overestimated the PCs by a good amount, nearly over 5 points. Everyone underestimated the Greens a little bit. So kudos to the Greens, I suppose. And that's really the kind of situation here with this election. it was going to be a hard one to fully capture because of this kind of late-breaking momentum. There's very few polls. And the way the kind of responders happened changes things a lot. But I do have some resolutions to make this better in the future. I don't have it broken down, because normally I'll break down like my 2.0 version. And I will note, I don't actually have these 6 regions here as regions that I've modeled in my model. I only actually have 3. I have these 3 and these 2. And it would be way too much work to break it into 6. What I'm actually going to do for the next New Brunswick election is break it into 6. You might be asking yourselves, what does that do? Well, first off, several of the firms, like Main Street, were actually breaking it into 5 already. So it's... I already have Fredericton, St. John, Moncton, CMA data from, say, Main Street. But it's also not that hard to demultiplex things like this. That's something you do in software all the time, or enough. And I know how to do that, or at least to a high enough accuracy level for it to matter. But by modeling it like this, it actually is more sensitive, because what I basically had is I had the Southwest here. Well, I had St. John, Fredericton in the Southwest as one quote-unquote region, which I think really underestimated how... a better way is Moncton area. I had Moncton and the Southwest, or Southeast, sorry, as one region. I think that really caused Moncton to be overestimated in how conservative it is. Because some of the polls at Main Street actually, form here. No, that's East Coast Moncton. Anyways, Main Street had Moncton a lot closer, so modeling like that I think would actually increase accuracy. I couldn't get you the numbers for it. But really, other than like a few tweaks like that for New Brunswick, there's really nothing I can say that my model from my digging, and I've dug a lot into this, my modeling itself isn't wrong. Like the actual software is not wrong. The configuration could have been used some work, again, these regions. But really the main issue is just 2 pollsters. It's very difficult to get an election right with 2 data points. It's only possible in this case because these 2 data points are actually very, very close, despite underestimating the Liberals. But that does make it hard. Is it my worst performance? Might be, actually. No, I think Ontario 22 is worse for hit rate, but better for popular vote. This is definitely my worst popular vote performance, I think. At 7.7 mean squared error. So not great. Not great. But I did get above the 80% hit rate. 80% hit rate's like, if you're getting below that, you're like, you're not doing much better than people just guessing. So that's kind of the story with this one. It's not the best one I've done, but given the circumstances of just 2 polls and the issues with the Holt's momentum at the end of the election not being fully captured, I think it's adequate. But let me know in the comments below if you think this is a terrible performance, if you think I can't claim the model results that I published technically like an hour after the election started. Let me know. Well, I bid you adieu, and I'll see you next week with something else.